Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you all for being here. We are thrilled to be able to offer you this workshop in collaboration with Dr. Rachel Hastings and Dr. Denise Stevenson. I'm Nate Sharp. I'm going to be one of your moderators for the. There's a little lag. There's a lag that's throwing me off a little bit, but I'll continue. So I'm a 55-year-old Southern California white surfer dude. I'm a father of 2 boys, one a student at MiraCosta, and I teach in the business department.
Well, Nate just had to step out for a moment to reset his camera and his audio. And so no worries, you all. This is going to fix the lag on his end. And I'm super excited to be here with Denise Stevenson as well. And we're going to be welcoming Nate back in just a moment here. So while we're waiting for Nate, I'll go ahead and allow Denise to introduce herself. And then Nate will come back in just a moment.
For that, when Nate finished, right? Here we go. Good morning, everyone. I'm Denise Stevenson. I'm a white working class Midwesterner by birth. I'm a first-generation college student who took my PhD in American Studies. I'm androgynous, and my pronouns are pers. I'm the faculty director of the Writing Center at MiraCosta. With cultural studies at the heart of my education, I've participated in identity and equity work periodically throughout my career. Recently, and belatedly, I admit, I have turned that work to focusing on race, that American taboo. Today's event helps me prepare for workshops I've developed for MiraCosta that start they start a week from yesterday. As a white person, I want to acknowledge my complicity in racist, many systems, it's not just one, that deliver privilege to my appearance. I commit to the anti-racist work of dismantling the master's house, which begins with finding my blind spots, today's title. So thank you all for being here for this vital and emotionally charged work.
I'm Dr. Rachel Hastings. I've been at MiraCosta since 2018, and this year I started out as a tenured professor and the director of NCHEA. So I'm so very excited to be here with you all today. And I join my white allies, my colleagues, and my comrades as a Black woman of Black and Filipino heritage who has a long-standing ethnic history within our family. I'm a first daughter, so that means that I am my mother's first daughter. She is her mother's first daughter. She is her mother's first daughter. And we can trace that back 6 generations. We also, I think it's important for me to note that I am the first Black woman in my family. So my mother is Filipino. Her mother was Filipino and Mexican. Her mother was full Mexican. So as you can see, I carry the whole world in my skin stories, in my spirit, and in my emotional responses to these particular situations. I've had the privilege of teaching and workshopping and lecturing both nationally and globally on these particular issues for the last 18 years. And really, I'm to support my 2 comrades in this particular racial blind spots. And I do hope that my friend Nate, who definitely put this entire presentation together, has an opportunity to rejoin us. And so I'm sure that he will be here. Dr. Cook, I see you in the chat. Thank you so much for being here. It means the world to us that you are actually joining us here in this particular session. One thing that we would love to ask you all to do before we jumpstart our conversation. Wow, there's my boy, Nate. Welcome back, my friend.
Sorry about that.
There's no apologies necessary. We all know that remote learning and remote teaching has technical glitches along the way. We went ahead and introduced ourselves, and so I just wrapped up my family heritage history, and I'd love for you to go ahead and introduce yourself again so our audience gets an opportunity to know you.
Thank you for that. Apologize for the technical hiccup there. So as I was saying earlier, I'm a 55-year-old white male. I teach in the business department. And We're going to unpack some racial boxes today. And we have Kelly Falcone of Palomar College, who is monitoring the chat. That's in the bottom right of your screen. No one's going to be called out individually, but we hope that you share at the level that you're comfortable with. And we do hope that our questions challenge you collectively. So one of the first things we're going to do is share our racial and cultural backgrounds in the chat. If you want to start typing that now, you can, and Kelly will summarize that out for us in a bit. So our hope is that you get into your hearts today and you share your personal insights. We hope that you share your fears, your hopes, your sadness, your frustration about our race relations, and that you walk away from this workshop with some insights about our racialized world, some tools that you can use to be an ally for people of color. And we also hope that you have an increased compassion just for our shared humanity. So as we go together to share an African proverb, if you want to go far, go together. So at this point, I was going to have the moderators introduce themselves, but since that's already done, we're going to move on to the share out in the chat. So go ahead and type in what is your best take at your racial and cultural identity in the chat.
Yeah, definitely. Tell us who you are. Tell us where you hail from. Tell us who your people are. Tell us where in the world you actually pull your roots from. We want to know a little bit about your history. Talking about it doesn't have to be something that is uncomfortable. It can actually be something that is celebratory. It could be something that we actually embrace. Look, Bettina says she's Finnish and Mexican. We want to honor that. Sumay said they are Turkish. I don't know genders here, so forgive me for slipping in the gender pronouns here. That's lovely. We have Maltese and English. We have South Asian. Pacific Islanders, so I'm going to give a shout out there. We've got Jamaicans in the house. Edward's a first-generation multi-ethnic male from Indonesia with Dutch parents surviving colonial oppression and Chicano reared in the U.S. My friends, we want to celebrate these things. These things are so important to us. Craig says that he is an instructor at Maricosta, and he's a white dude of Italian descent. Christy is Scandinavian. Dr. Cook is born in India and immigrated to the U.S. Awesome. We have somebody who's from Iran and Persian, right? We have Irish and Scottish New Yorker in the house. We love this, my friends. We want to make sure that as we go through and unpack these racial myths and racial, uncomfortable spots in our systems, in our bodies, that we also own every single part of our skin story. That is going to be one of the most important aspects to this particular journey that we're on. Robin, thank you. Eastern European, Welsh, English, Slovakian. So I had to take a moment to make sure it rolled off the tongue really nicely. Kelly, 41-year-old white, Irish, and Italian woman. Yes. Grandfather came over from Italy, lived in New Jersey, and was known to walk around town singing in Italian. I love it. My mom said that our very first ancestor who came from the Philippines spoke Tagalog or Filipino, and he didn't know it. They just, didn't know what was going on, because when we came to the United States, we were taught to do what? Speak English, right? And I think one thing that we want to make sure that everybody knows is that we honor you and we want you to come as you are. So thank you so much for having the courage to put that in the chat, right? Diane, Latinx, born in South Texas. Don't tell anybody, but I'm in Central Texas right now. So I'm celebrating with you here and today. How awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that, my friends.
That is great to see all this humanity piece. So, on behalf of the moderators, I'll say we believe you're not here just to log some professional development hours or share your learnings from a book, or just because you want to be seen in this space, or just because of the academic discourse piece. So what we really believe as moderators is that, like us, you're here because, your heart is hurting. We believe that you're appalled and grief-stricken by what's happening in our country with race relations. And we believe, most importantly, that you want to do something about it. We believe that you want to act. So we're here today to kind of support our collective growth. We're going to reveal some blind spots so we can be better allies. And our next question in the chat that we'd like you to input, please, is when you think about an ally, who's had your back in your life? Who have you turned to for support and inspiration in your life? Because it's so important to know that you have allies. So go ahead and put in the chat real quickly, who are some allies that have been there for you?
I put my mama. She has my back since birth. She will have my back all the way to the end. She's the woman who encouraged me to actually get a PhD. I won't tell you all the trouble that I put her in between ages 12 and 14, but I had to get a PhD to make up for those years. So that should give you an idea. Awesome. We see some mothers out there. We see our friends who are supportive of us. We have parents. We have teachers, parents while they were alive, and now a wife, a partner. Absolutely. During this particular journey, you have to bring those who support you into the picture. We have to go on this journey as a journey of love and as a journey of support. And I hope that, you know, as we call upon our partners, as we call upon our children, as we call upon our friends, that we also turn inward to our colleagues within our tri-campus community. A part of this conference is really about rubbing elbows with people who share like mine. And so thank you so much for giving a shout out to the Los Angeles homies, right? Oma and Opa and the circle of colleagues that speak truth and see you. To friends, a great niece, Holly Denise, thank you. Diane, family, mom, dad, older sister, and brother. Absolutely. All of these individuals, they're with us on our journey. And we definitely invite them in spirit and in body to be here with us.
Thank you. So I do want to do a quick shout out just to say to the white people who are in this workshop today, offer up that, you know, we are both the problem and the solution to a lot of the racial dysfunction in America today. And we really have a responsibility to enact change. And the change has to come from people in power. So you'll hear terms like white supremacy, and we're going to share some data with you that, you know, might be a hard swallow for you to look at. So we want to look at that power divide that we have in our country. But fear not, between the moderators and our attendees, we have everything we need to unpack our racial blind spots today. So our next piece is, before we jump into our survey questions, and Rachel's going to be putting up some Google form links in the chat. You'll click on those, you'll fill out the forms. We'll reveal the findings, and then the moderators will unpack these a little bit further for you all and share some data. But before we do that, how do you feel? How do you feel going into this survey piece where we're going to ask you to kind of mine your opinions about your potential racial blind spots? What feelings do you feel?
Nervous? Tell us if you're feeling nervous. It's all good.
I'm feeling nervous.
We got you, Denise.
I know you do.
Sawubona, Sawubona, we see you. Absolutely. Let's do this. Thank you, Bettina. Thank you.
The surveys are anonymous.
The surveys are absolutely anonymous. Don't be nervous. I'll tell you what I told the other moderators before we came on, and my secret tip that I give all my public speaking students, but don't tell anybody because you'll get me fired, but squeeze your butt 100 times and give that adrenaline someplace to go, work it out muscular wise, and I promise that we're going to be okay on this journey. Oh, vulnerable is definitely a good place to be, right? Absolutely. It is going to be an open process. It is going to be something that will touch your insides, and hopefully that will transform you in a way where you can actually make changes in your behaviors and in your patterns in an informed way, not just because this is what the dominant norm is actually telling us is what's supposed to happen. Absolutely. We're hopeful too, and absolutely we're thankful too for your presence at our presentation today. So you all want to jump right into those wonderful surveys that we have. Thank you, Diane. I think that this is a safe space too. I know I feel confident and safe amongst my colleagues, and I'm so glad that you all feel that too. It is going to be a little bit emotional, but know that the chat is available for you at all times, and that if you chat with us, we're definitely going to chat with you along the way.
And it looks like we have a good sample size here. We've got 42 people in the workshop. So, you know, there's no right or wrong answers. We want honest answers. Honest answers creates honest dialogue. and honest dialogue creates learning. So we're going to go ahead and move into the surveys. There's 4 topic areas, so there'll be a couple of questions for each topic area. Rachel's going to lead on the first topic area, which is who can be racist? Who can be racist? And so there'll be a Google form link that's going to go in the chat. You'll want to click on that, open that as a new browser tab, and it's just a couple of quick questions, and then we'll reveal those survey findings, and then we'll talk about it a little bit more. So the link is in the chat right now, so you go ahead and click on that, open it as a new link, and we'll do that too as moderators.
These are not trick questions, my friends. Again, there are no right or wrong answers. And so we really are just looking for your honest assessment of where you are. And then as a group, we'll be able to collectively take a look at where we're at.
It's a quick survey. I took mine.
Great. Awesome. We're starting to see the surveys come in. Up to 28 on my end.
And you'll probably notice in the survey that some of the questions you may not be forced into an answer that you have to think about a little bit more, but that's partly intentional for the dialogue.
Lovely. We're up to 30 responses, which is great. We'll just give it another minute or so to see if any of our other colleagues want to join us on this journey. I don't want to assume that all 40 attendees are here with us. They might be hanging out in the expo or trying to get their network on, even though I hope they're with us.
Could also be true that depending on people's devices, doing both things is challenging. So some of you may not be able to do the survey and stay in this room. So
very true. Absolutely. Well, Nate, we have a nice round number of 32 individuals who participated in our survey. And it looks like that has kind of slowed down the incoming responses. Would we like to reveal the data now?
Yep.
All right, my friends, let's see how we did. Question number 1. All whites are racist. 81.3% of us said false. 18.8% said true. Let us know in the chat how you feel about those particular numbers. Do you guys think that you agree with these, or do you think that, you know, they're skewed one way or another? Any type of feedback that you would love to offer us, we are here to listen. There we go. Our number switched up just a little bit. The 21.2% increase for true. Lisa, no worries. We'll put the link in the chat again for you.
I also see Christy pointing out, racist or have implicit biases. And I think that's such a great question because it's a hard question to answer without a definition on the screen, right? And I think so often one of our problems with this zone is that when we heard the term racist, we think the white cone-wearing, cross-burning, white supremacist that's very clear about their position on race. And for me, I did actually say that I think all whites are racist, but I think that because of my definition is that our systems are racist. So I believe that as a white woman, I can't not be. It's not that I have intention there. I don't intentionally do racist acts, but I do benefit from racist systems. So it's hard to let go of the term and say it doesn't apply to me. But I do that knowing that hasn't always been my perspective, right? I don't say that saying that I believe you should think that. It's just where I am at this time.
Absolutely.
I know when I hear the term racist, and if it feels like it's being directed in my direction, I too, want to run in fear. But I also answered that, yes, I do think all white people are racist. As Denise was saying, just from the reality that's been my experience of 55 years of growing up in what is a white-dominated society. And if that is true, and I've benefited, which I know I have, then there's so many layers to unpack to that, right? But the first step is kind of acknowledging what I'm walking around with and what benefits that provides me.
I also think when I allow myself to claim the term, that it calls me to do something about it. Whereas when I bury it, when I pretend I'm not racist or say I'm not racist, then racism becomes about intentionality. And I don't think that the majority of our problem is about intentionality. I think it's about things we don't even see. So that original question about implicit bias, it's buried in the culture I was raised in. It's the water I swim in. I wish it weren't, but it is.
And I think to Denise's point, one thing that is true is that all white people are born into a racist society, right? And this racist society operates in a way that privileges some bodies over others. And so as a dominant group, white folks do gain privileges from the system that we operate in. And we're gonna actually give you a little bit of background and information about how that works in a moment, but I'm gonna go ahead and just slide down to the second answer to see what you all thought about whether or not Black folks and people of color could be racist as well. So here's the number. Okay.
There's some good comments in the chat too that hopefully we can circle back on. I know
absolutely
Tumay and Patrick had some good comments.
Absolutely. So before we jump into the chat with those, I just want to point out the data here from our particular group. 72.7% of us said Black people and people of color can be racist. And 27.3% of Black people and people of color cannot be racist. And I'm just curious, as we return to the chat, if you would be kind enough to actually indicate why we think, that Black folks cannot be racist. What is the difference? Like, why do you think, they cannot be racist? That's going to be an important factor in some of the information that we share. While we're doing that, Barbara said that being white does not make a person racist. And Edward, on the contrary, said that white supremacist systems create racist ideology and practices that people follow until these behaviors become normalized. Okay? Tumay said, I'm just cautious in saying yes to statements that have all in it. I totally understand that. We don't want to essentialize one group of individuals at all. But I do not prefer putting everyone in a group based on their skin color. I do think that's a very cautious way to approach this. And also, I think it would be healthy if we actually do lump some groups of people into their particular skin stories because that's how racialized systems work. We get lumped into these particular disadvantages based on our skin color. And if we don't actually acknowledge that, then there's no way that we can actually dismantle that. So it's okay to embrace the uncomfortable and get comfortable with being uncomfortable along the way. Patrick said that they were born in the United States, therefore I am American. I didn't have a choice. I am white, living in a racist system that was built to give me an advantage. Absolutely. I think that's definitely something that we want to ground ourselves in. Edward said unconscious racism is prevalent in everyday life in the US and abroad. Racism is a global issue. What we know is that 86% of the world was impacted by colonialism, and that means that oppression and racial oppression has impacted all of us across the globe in some way, shape, or form. Racism in the United States may not look like racism in South Africa, may not look like racism in France, may not look like racism in China, but racism is prevalent across the globe. I like what Robbie said here, that all whites aren't racist, but that they believe that many whites are victims of institutionalized racism. I think it is important that we recognize that all of us are victims of racism because it's impacted our communities in different ways. Some of us have benefited off of that, whereas others have been put at a disadvantage. Thank you, Craig, for supporting Denise and Nate and some of the other individuals who are here. Great. Tomei said they selected that Black people and people of color cannot be racist per the definition of racism. The biases need to come from a place of power. That's what we're talking about, and we're going to get to that in just a second. That power can put other groups into oppression. Great. Kendra said, if you think in a global context, Black people can be racist. Okay. And then Edward said, is the power structure in Mexico, Africa, etc., stem from a white supremacist system that's been in place from centuries of the world? I think if you look across colonialism and the impact that it's had, that yes, it does cut across all of these different kind of continents and nation states in different ways. Now I'm going to stop sharing this particular screen so I can go back to the slide for a moment. And this is the equation that we'd like you to think about racism, right? We use racism as a term. It operates, it's in our language base, but also it benefits for us to be able to understand the actual equation for racism. If you're curious about where this equation came from, it came from Beverly Daniel Tatum and her book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? She's a longstanding race theorist and practitioner. And so her definition and equation is prejudice plus discrimination plus power equals racism. Right? So when we ask if Black people and people of color can be racist, the answer is no, right? And the reason it's no is because as a group, we don't have enough power to actually move prejudice and discrimination into action, right? Can people of color and Black people be prejudiced? Absolutely. I own that. Can we be discriminatory? 100% we can. But as a group, could we actually vote to move an entire group of people to an internment camp or to separate them into another part of our society? No, we don't have that particular power as a group to be able to do that. What we understand is that all of us operate in a system of disadvantages, and we all hold multiple different identities with various levels of privilege. And I don't want to take away from that today, my friends. I want to acknowledge that each of us have identities that have advantages and disadvantages, right? We hold different races. We hold different economic statuses. Many of us have fluid gender identities, fluid sexual identities, various physical and mental capabilities. We have different religions, different ages, different body sizes and styles. But one thing that we want to make sure that we walk away with is that racial subjectivity is the embodiment of all of these identities. So not one of those identities on the other page is free from the racialized system that we actually operate in. We're not able to just say, I can only look at my gender identity without honoring the fact that that gender identity is also racialized. As a Black woman, I do not share the same female experience as my white counterpart. There are definitely some ways in which we will act and respond in solidarity with one another, but there are some huge historical differences that very clearly make our frame of reference quite different. And when we experience the world in a variety of different ways because of this. And I want to be able to honor those differences as much as possible. So let's talk a little bit about institutional racism, right? When we talk about racism becoming institutionalized, we're talking about the systematic distribution of resources, power, opportunity in our society to the benefit of people who are white and at the exclusion of people of color. And I know what you're thinking, like, let's get some examples. All throughout this presentation, we are going to have a number of different examples that point to how racism has become institutionalized and normalized throughout our society. What's the main difference here? Why is this not just like, bigotry or prejudice here? Well, there are two different differences. First, the existence of systematic policies and practices within institutions that effectually disadvantage certain racial or ethnic groups, right? So it's a system of policies and practices. And then we have to have the power to enforce and perpetuate those policies and practices in ways that are invested in white folks, right? Does this mean that all of this is intentional? Not necessarily, but those unconscious biases need to be unpacked if we truly are going to have an equitable system that we operate within. Oop. When you take institutionalized racism and we think about how does it get processed out into different policies and practices, you start to see things like slavery, settlements, Indian reservations, segregation, internment camps. All of these are social practices and policies that operate still to this very day. And then what happens is this is resulted in racial stratification and disparities. And if you look across public housing, public education, public healthcare, and our government in general, we can clearly see the racial stratification and disparities that cut across all of these different aspects of our society. So, how are y'all feeling now? We've had an opportunity to kind of think about and unpack what institutionalized racism is, and you might be experiencing some micro discomfort. That's okay. I think it's perfectly okay.
And to those housing and education, healthcare factors that Rachel was calling out, we're going to share some data with you later behind those numbers.
We're going to share the second survey with you. And this will move us into a little bit more both personal and not so personal aspects, those micro discomforts. And so we take it from the larger kind of systemic, on the large scale and kind of bringing it back into our body again. Yes, I'm going to take you back to the heart now, Edward. Our right brain had to kick in. The professor in us is like, we need to make sure we ground ourselves in definitions, but truly internalizing this information and feeling it in our system and feeling it in our spirit is really what's going to make us have a full and complete understanding of how these things work and operate. I went ahead and put the second form in the chat for you. And this survey is on micro discomforts. Again, no right or wrong answers here. And as you all complete that survey, I'm going to go ahead and try to bring it right back up for you on the screen.
For those of you who wish there weren't silence, we also wished for that. We prepared music, or Nate did, but bandwidth being what it is, we're embracing the silence together just to share and be with you.
And thank you, Craig. We appreciate your feedback on the explanation of the surveys. We do know that these questions are uncomfortable. We kind of designed them that way so we can get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And we definitely appreciate your feedback. You know, Edward, you are absolutely correct. Ambiguous ethnic identities do allow more doors to open. In some ways, that ability to pass and that ability to pass, it just makes people more comfortable when you look and appear similar to them. And sometimes that passing could also get people into trouble, right? You might assume one person's ethnic identity or racial background, and then you start to talk and to chat, and then you realize that, oh no, I might have just seriously offended somebody. And then you have that micro discomfort that we're about to unpack in just a moment. I know for me, a lot of my Latinx students, this is one of my favorite, kind of ways to talk about it. But I have my Latinas who are like, I appear white, and people start talking about me like, are talking about, my Mexican heritage. And they don't even know that, I'm of that particular background until I open up my mouth and start spitting that Spanish at them. And they have to check themselves in the moment. And it's one of those beautiful moments where I learned a long time ago from a white male who introduced me to my racial consciousness, who said, we just can't assume. We cannot assume, especially in a multi-ethnic culture, that we know who someone is just by the skin that they are wearing every day. I think that is hugely important. I've been misidentified a number of different times in my life. And also, depending on my hair, I can pass easily, or I can make people feel differently. Big hair, don't care, and the afro that doesn't quite, afro out kind of makes people feel a little bit differently than when I have my straight hair and I can flip a little bit. And those are all a part of our body politics that we carry into this conversation.
I think we can take about 30 seconds for folks to answer the survey, and maybe we give a little, Edward had a good point of reflective Buddha-centric time. Maybe 30 seconds would be sufficient. Whenever you're feeling that you have an ample N size, Rachel, you can. The chat discussion keeps going, which is fantastic.
Oh, I love it. Thank you so much. And May, I hope that I am actually saying your name correctly. I know that naming is so important. And so if I'm mispronouncing your name, just know that my heart and my spirit are with you. But the comment here that Black people have been oppressed, threatened, discriminated against, and being violent against for years, I think we can handle slight discomfort to push us towards making progress in anti-racist efforts. Change is uncomfortable. If we're not uncomfortable, there cannot be change. Took me a moment, but I got it. I agree, 100%. A small moment of discomfort could actually result in people's livelihoods transforming in a way where they feel freer to be them in their own skin. Speaking of skin, we have 35 responses, and I am super curious to see what your responses are to the questions that are on this survey. So, colleagues, are we ready to flip to the responses? All right, let's do it. All right, so the first question, I am comfortable in my own skin. We have 8.6 people say that they strongly disagree. We have 17.1% who say that they disagree. We have 17.1% who say, I'm kind of neutral. We have 40% who agree, I'm comfortable in my skin. And we have 17.1% who are rocking loud and proud to say, you're damn right, I'm here, I'm proud, I'm loud, and I'm not changing for anyone. Okay, I just added that extra on there, but that's how I interpret it. Because when I say that I'm uncomfortable with my skin, I'm 100% comfortable in my skin today. If you would have asked me 20 years ago, no. This has been a journey in terms of loving myself for myself and within myself, and being able to actually unpack all of my multiple heritages that I carry within me, and to find a place to say each of those particular parts of my identity, and my racial identity specifically, are me. That I'm not half this, half that. I'm 100% all of that, right? I've had people say stupid things to me. I'll just put it out there. They would ask me, well, what part of your, which half is black? The top half or the bottom half? Okay, I don't know how that makes sense at all. There's not really a way to pull it apart and then put it back together again. We carry it all within us at the same time. So, my friends out there, can I ask in the chat, for those of you who said, or either whether you are fully comfortable in your skin or not comfortable in your skin, like, what are some of the reasons that you are or are not comfortable?
I know for me, as speaking as a white dude, through the process over this summer of reading a lot of these books and going more from the intellectual knowledge to heartfelt knowledge and accountability and realization, wow, I have participated in racism, and as a result, I'm uncomfortable. So I've gone to a place of more uncomfortableness because of the feeling of realizing that I'm part of this structure. This isn't white shame, but it's more like white accountability. And then as I've had the opportunity and the honor to start, working with more colleagues of color and hearing their experiences and really starting to understand, here's what it feels like to be Black, to be Latin, Latinx. It's, really feeling that, and it didn't feel good. Didn't feel good to know, and then my own discomfort with that, because I know for me, I'm a single father, 2 boys. I've never had to worry about them getting in the car and going off to work, and are they going to be stopped by the police? I've never had to worry about that. I've noticed that they got jobs pretty easily out of high school and out of college. It wasn't that difficult. And there's a lot of racial tension that I haven't experienced as I've moved around through the world as a white dude who's had, most of the advantages. And so coming to grips with that, like, here's what it would feel like if I was, a Black man, and what that experience would be like. And so my own discomfort and challenges, working through the pandemic as we all deal with, challenges with isolation and work focus. And I realized, like, well, I haven't had some of these other challenges. And, that's so that actually I have been more uncomfortable but I'm leaning into that uncomfortableness because it's helping me learn and helping me want to act.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Denise? I know we talked about this before in our pre-meeting, but I'm curious, like, comfortable in our own skin, uncomfortable in our own skin, took a little while.
I'm relatively comfortable in my own skin, but I think that's partially because in my PhD program in the 90s, when identity politics was huge and I was in that kind of cultural studies program, we all got very comfortable announcing in many settings, as we're starting to redo again today, who we were and how we see ourselves. And I learned that I needed to be fine, not only with myself, but with, if I assumed about someone something they weren't, right? So like if I left out your Filipino heritage by assuming you were only Black, that you would correct me and that would be fine, right? And therefore that if somebody assumed something about me, that's fine, because we're doing that based on appearance, and that's
Right.
what we have. And the willingness to announce that means I can shift your understanding of who I am just by telling you and not necessarily being defensive about it. So I didn't feel wildly comfortable, right? Like strongly, but I feel comfortable because I think that's where I am.
Absolutely. You know, two things came to mind as I'm, reading through the chat here, and I'm also listening to you all as my colleagues. And I'll go to the chat here to say, folks have been commenting as well. Judith said, I'm comfortable in my own skin until I leave the house and feel people staring at me, trying to figure out if I'm male, am I female, right? This really triggered the intercultural professor in me, and it made me to think of two different types of identities that we have. We have avowed identities that we create, that we hold fast and true to ourselves, that we actually name ourselves. Those are avowed identities. And then we have ascribed identities. So identities that are called out by other people or ascribed onto our bodies in ways that make us feel uncomfortable. And it's the battle between both ascribed and avowed identities that we struggle with. And so I 100% hear you and feel you on that part. The unknowing part. And I think that makes, us uncomfortable on both sides. The people who don't know are curious. They want to know. And so they're just labeling, right, instead of inquiring. And then sometimes when they do inquire, they get some kickback, right? It's like, well, what are you? Human? Thank you very much. Well, where are your people from? The United States? Thank you very much. Like, what are you really trying to ask in these questions, right? And that us trying to figure out how to unpack our language to be more direct and to be more targeted so that we get straight directly to the point is something I think will benefit all of us along the way, right? I had someone here who said that they totally agree and it's been a lifelong journey. Another one who said periods of growth are uncomfortable and I'm less comfortable recently learning that I need to change. Absolutely, especially when you're grown and you're like, I've been grown for the last enter this number of years here. And now you have to unpack all of those years of you doing the same behaviors and having the same patterns to figure out if you are on the path that you want to be on. And this is a lifelong journey. Please don't think that you're going to walk away from this particular 90-minute presentation and that you're going to be cured. There is no cure for racism, my friends. There is only hard work and investigation on self so that we can be comfortable in who we are in our own skin and be kindful and mindful to those individuals that we invite to interact with us. That is a lifelong journey, a revolutionary, a transformative journey that we will be on until, from birth to death. It's one of those wonderful, unfortunate truths that we have to embrace. Nate, you have a shout out here from Dr. Cook, who says that she's known you for a long time and applauds your courage and your desire to learn and to lead. Thank you. And Edward says, I've been on my ethnic identity journey since 1985. Loving my Dutch side was a process, given that my other side, Indonesian, was colonized for over 45 years and impacted my father's life in and outside of the U.S. I also identify as Chicano in the U.S. since 8 years old, rooting my dissertation in these beautiful threads that run through me, rooted my voice, identity, and ambiguous nature. I love that. Absolutely. And as I had just mentioned, that's decades of us unpacking and becoming comfortable with all parts of our identities. And Eric says, comfortability in my own skin depends on the setting. Some feel good and others feel different. Oftentimes the feeling of blending in is comfortable feeling for me, but I hope to get better with this. And I think that kind of leads us into the next set of questions that we have here as well. How confident are we talking about race among friends and family? Let's check it out. 1 was the lowest and 5 being the highest, most comfortable talking about these issues with family and friends. So 3 people of the group said that they're not comfortable at all talking about race among friends and family. I want to be clear here that that's perfectly okay, right? some families are not safe spaces to talk about these particular issues. I know that when I came home talking about my Black power, Black liberation, my Filipino family was like, what is going on here? Like, I mean, I was reared around mostly my Filipino family. If you put us all together, we kind of look like a Gap ad because everybody's Filipino and Black, Filipino and white, Filipino and Mexican. And so it became one of those things where my Blackness had to teach my family how to have these wonderful conversations about who we are. And, you know, as I mentioned this, it fills my heart because my family really embraced that. What I didn't know is that my Filipino family members were on the front line with Black folks during the 60s to get the very first Black Studies department at San Francisco State built up. My uncle, who has since passed, marched with the Black Panthers. All right, he was a part of like documenting the Black Panther Party. My father said that there was a Black Panther Party house around the corner from his home when he grew up. And so the children in the neighborhood would go there and have reading circles. Like, I would never have known that my Filipino family was so involved in these cross-cultural kind of cross-cultural movements. If I had not asked, if I had not come home with all of this information, this knowledge, and shared that with them. And so even if we're uncomfortable, I want to encourage you to at least try. Right? You know whether or not it's safe for you or not, but I know that my family has changed just off of the conversations that we've had, and it's made them think about things in a very different way. We had 5 individuals who said they were not so comfortable, 8 individuals who are pretty neutral about their comfortable level, 11 people who said that, yes, they're comfortable, talking about race among family, and 8 who said, absolutely, bring it on. We're definitely comfortable about talking about race amongst family and friends. I would love it if you all would share in the chat, what are some of the comforts or discomforts of raising these issues up amongst your friends and family? Looking at the chat here, Tanisa agrees with Dr. Cook. Being vulnerable comes with the openness of being judged and having to accept the outcome of others. Absolutely. This is not something that can be easily accepted by the ideology set within the American culture. Thank you, Nate. And Craig says, thank you for sharing. Like Nate, I'm a white guy working on becoming more empathetic and understanding. He said it best. I always felt comfortable, but my wife is Chinese, Mexican, Native American, and I have heard firsthand about many times that she has felt uncomfortable in her skin. And this is so helpful for him because they can better understand not only colleagues and students, but those at home as well. I'm already feeling more aware due to this conversation. Thank you so much for that. Oh, that's such a blessing. I'm going to scroll down here. Nate, you want to go ahead and take us on this one?
Absolutely. And I have my partner is mixed race, half Iraqi. And it's funny, every time we're in a social setting, there's almost, you can almost count to 10 and somebody, and usually a white person, is going to ask her, where are you from? Where do you come from? And I think, and Denise was mentioning this earlier, that there is this human nature to want to identify people and understand, where you're from. But it is what has been interesting for me in that relationship as a white person is seeing who's the one asking the question. And it's 100% time always been a white person who's asking the question, where are you from? And I've never seen people of color ask that question when I'm in a social setting. So our next topic, and we love the chat that's going along here. So our next topic is this category of, quote, free to be successful, which we could also categorize as a belief in meritocracy. And I teach in the business department. So capitalism is at the core of what we teach. And for those of you who've read Kendi's book, he does poke some significant holes in capitalism and talks about racial capitalism. And so we have a couple of questions coming up next in the next link here that are going to pry a little bit at this concept of it's America, you're free to be successful. And so let's go ahead and put that link in there.
Heading to the chat now with the actual link. Awesome. There you are, my friends.
And while folks are filling that out, I'll just share out a little bit further on that. But, you know, I think me and Denise as white people, you know, both admittedly like feeling, wow, we're a little late to the party here as far as becoming involved. But we're here now. But what held me back? And I think, you know, exploring my upbringing and, you know, which was low income and a single mom, and feeling like, well, I don't really have any economic advantages, so therefore I'm not racist because I'm struggling too. But later on, as my career advanced and looking back and realizing, wow, I was really bought into this free to be successful piece, which actually contributed to me being racist in the sense that I wasn't an agent of change and I wasn't getting involved. I was using that as my reason behind that. So that's why we want to explore this series of questions. I'm going to go ahead and answer those as well.
I love these share outs in the chat here, and I'll go ahead and scroll through some of them. Christy says, I'm learning every day from my daughter. She's multi-ethnic, but only now is starting to embrace her Latin side at age 18, as here in Oceanside, the majority of her friends are multiracial and ethnic. Like I said, my mother is Filipino, so we did not share the same skin story. So this brings some tears to my eyes thinking about how we've had to connect across these cultural differences. My mother worked in the Sacramento School District for 30 years, predominantly Black schools. So her investment went beyond just her children, but spread out into the community as well. And she is my biggest supporter. Sari said in discussions that they like hearing multi-generational thoughts on all this. And I think that multi-generational kind of connection is super important to linking the historical to the contemporary, right? We are living histories of these particular moments, and those histories are dynamic, so they're constantly changing over time. And if we ask our grandparents and our great-grandparents and then turn around to ask our children, we'll notice that our experiences of our particular ethnic identities, racial identities, are not the same, that there are nuances between those generations. Bettina says, talking about race and ethnicity with my family can be such a weird experience sometimes. I'm usually the person asking, well, why do you think that? Or where did you hear that? And then there's just silence in the room. I completely understand. I've been there as well. And one thing that I have encouraged is being a good listener. Because sometimes when we are inquiring, it kind of feels like we're digging, and some people might even say that we're being aggressive or attacking. I would not use that language because I understand that those are loaded terms. But I do think family members I came off very assertive in my family. So I've learned how to become a good listener and just ask a lot of questions to see how comfortable they are with responding. Judith says, sadly, most of her friends are racist. They don't think they are, but they are. Talking about it has caused a rift in many friendships, and it's okay. I hate losing friends, but it won't stop me from checking racism when I see and hear it. I applaud that 100%. If your friends cannot take your opinion on issues of racism, then they are not your friends. And you don't want to be a part of a toxic community that continues to perpetuate a system that disadvantages other individuals. So I applaud you, and I continue to root for you, Judith, as you take these issues on. Edward, my family witnessed my educational project on multi-ethnicity, not all, to talk about this. And we have to respect those boundaries, right?
I'm sorry.
We have to respect those boundaries in our family. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We have a question in the chat about universal high performance, and if it's possible to get a definition of that as they're filling out their surveys. Nate, can you answer that?
That is going to be answered on the slide that we're going to show when we do the data reveal. Robin, we will definitely have an answer for you. We don't want to reveal it beforehand. We kind of just want you to use your own interpretation, and then we will see where you fall on the scale of things. But thank you. I thank you.
I want to you can always change your answer after.
Yeah.
Not on the survey, but personally.
Right. Absolutely.
I wanted to circle back and just make sure, did we get the slide deck pieces that you wanted to cover on micro discomforts and tone policing?
You know, what I'll do is I'll make sure that I put our particular presentation in the booth, a booth for us post-presentation. And that way anyone can go through and actually get the theoretical. What I'm loving right now about this conversation is that it's staying in the heart and in the emotional response, and that we're getting an opportunity to really connect with people across their own stories. And so definitions, we'll give them to you all in a slide deck later on.
Fair enough.
Since you bring that up, Nate, I do want to point out something I've noticed. So microaggressions was part of that we didn't go into as fully. And one of the ones being brought up that Rachel mentioned, and it's been in the chat several times, is that question, where are you from? I've been working with my student writing consultants on race issues this semester. And I think questions like that really confuse them. Right? They understand the microaggression where someone is accusatory, but they're missing some of the microaggressions where it's so embedded that we don't, it's a blind spot, right? It's what we're talking about today. It's so embedded that we don't even notice that by saying, where are you from? There's an assumption, one, you're not from here, and two, you are other.
You're not white.
Or, well, and or you're not part of my group. Right? I think it's most often said by white people. And so, yes, I think it's mostly a white question, but it means I'm in my question, I'm saying you're not familiar, and how damaging that is, right?
How insulting.
Yeah.
Yes. I think that's where, you know, I put the slide up here. We will for sure make sure that you all get that as a slide deck later on. But I did put the slide with the definitions here just so folks can take a look at it. Micro assaults, micro insults, and then micro invalidations. And so there are definitely shades of aggression. The more aggressive would be assaults in terms of conscious, intentional actions and slurs, using racial epithets, putting swastikas out there, or deliberately serving white folks before people of color in a restaurant, or assaults, you know, micro assaults. And micro means that it happens on a constant, everyday basis, right? It's a daily attack, if you will. It's not something that just is out of the blue, but it's normalized. So oftentimes you don't even realize that, you know, subconsciously you're participating in these type of actions. The micro insults was exactly what Denise was talking about, the verbal and nonverbal communication that just subtly conveys a little bit of rudeness and insensitivity that demeans a person's racial heritage or identity. And then there's also just the invalidation part, that the communication that subtly excludes or negates or nullifies the thoughts, feelings, and experiences of a person of color. I definitely think these are useful terms for us to embrace.
I was going to add an example that might actually land even further for some of the white folks in the workshop. I live on a golf course, and I'm not a golfer, and I'm neutral about folks who golf, but the way my house is situated, at least once a day, I get a golf ball that hits the roof of my house, and it says ping, and it always startles me. And it used to not bother me, but because it happens every day, I found that I started getting charged about it, and I actually started hating golfers. And for me, I'm like, you know, this must be what it feels like to be on the receiving end of constant micro assaults, micro insults, micro invalidations. The person who's doing it isn't even conscious that they're doing it, but boy, it sure is impacting me. And so that's my golf course example.
I hate to say it hits home, but it definitely hits home, Nate.
We do have time in the schedule if you wanted. You taught me so much through the tone policing piece. I was hoping.
Yes.
Okay.
Nate, you and I are on the right page. I think that most times when you tell somebody, I've had lots of microaggressions, micro assaults across my time. When I was at Chico State, I did my undergrad at Chico State. I was on the competitive public speaking team. And so we were nationally ranked, we kicked butt. And I did a number of different performances across the nation. And there was one of my teammates who would consistently throw shade along the way. I'm not going to tell you what we called her because we weren't very nice either. But, you know, I will say that I recognize now that a lot of what she was doing was tone policing, right? When you tell somebody, like if I were to tell, she would ask a question like, you know, what's sweet potato pie? As if Black people are the only people who know what sweet potato pie is. It's pie made out of what? Sweet potatoes, sweet potato pie. It makes total sense. All different people make sweet potato pie, but she would intentionally ask me questions that were rooted in my culture. And then if I were to tell her something back, like, why are you talking to me, you know, like crazy like that? Then she would feel attacked and listening to the thing that I was, my argument, she would revert to, a tactic that dismisses the idea of being communicated because apparently I was angry or frustrated or sad or feel for some other emotionally charged manner. Right now, let me put this in a different way. When you are talking to someone and they, you know, tell you that they're upset with you in some way and you choose to address the emotion, that is a form of tone policing. You cannot tell somebody how to tell you about their issue. What's important is that you understand the issue that they are trying to communicate to you, because we know in communication that our emotional response, our emotional intelligence is also at play. Now, I don't want to dismiss how you feel in this situation either, but if you want to be anti-racist, I highly encourage you to check your own emotional response and try to figure out what the actual argument is and try to aim on that. And this is something that happens both personally and interpersonal conversations and on a large scale in terms of systematic issues. And I'll just give you two issues of tone policing on a large scale. One example is when Google fired and disciplined employees for speaking out about diversity, right? They want to make their workplace a safer space for them to live and operate. But at the same time, Google didn't want to hear it. So what did they do? They just fired them and kept it pushing. And so those institutionalized racism remained operating there. And the same thing happened at Yelp. You know, any voice is better than silence. They fired Yelp employee who reacts to media backlash. And these are two kind of mainstream businesses that we all are familiar with. Every day we use Google. Many of us go to Yelp to figure out what restaurant we're going to go to, or, you know, whether or not we're going to go here or go there pre-COVID, right? And this is the type of like tone policing that is happening and operating within their place of business and how their employees are actually feeling about it as well.
And I can dovetail on that a little bit. You know, this was outlined in So You Want to Talk About Race in that book, but the author, it really made sense to me as a white person where she said, if a person of color is telling you they're having an issue, a racial issue with your discussion or what's happening, believe it. Believe it.
Yep.
Because that's they're coming from a different place than you are as a white person. So when they actually do that, they're actually trying to connect. So people of color are trying to connect with me by telling me these issues. Like they're actually trying to help me and be a friend. And so me being defensive, I would imagine if I was a person of color, extending the olive branch to connect with that person and share, that would be crushing and deflating.
Yeah.
Because you're trying to connect with that person as a friend, as an ally. And so I'm operating more from the standpoint of a person of color is telling me that this is a racial issue. My response is okay.
Yeah, and to mull it over a little bit. Yep. You know, I want to acknowledge Judith's comment here in the chat where they say, can't even count how many times I felt invisible trying to get service. It's so obvious. My girlfriend and I know where, when she gets better service, almost everywhere, except home auto parts stores. Right? You start to know what stores and how the individuals who work and represent those stores and brands treat you. When I went to school in the Midwest, it was the first time I had blatant racism in my face. I grew up in California in a very multi-ethnic, space, multi-ethnic family. So when I got to Southern Illinois and this woman basically threw my silverware at me at the restaurant, I came to understand that I wasn't in California anymore. And I had to be very careful about where I went and who I went there with, because the more people who looked like me, who went with me, the more we would experience, just blatant racism. I was at a tournament for a speech in Illinois, and 5 Black women in suits and heels. We were looking badass that day. Went into the convenience store, and there was a police officer who was walking out as we were going in, and the police officer came right back in after us and literally stood and watched us the entire time that we were there in the store. And so, us being 22 years old, we kind of just played around and stayed in the store to see how long they would actually stay in the store. But it was one of those things where you feel very surveyed. You feel very policed, just playing who you are in the world. And those are the type of experiences that we really hope to transform moving forward. Is it Elvia? They said, I'm always told I'm too passionate. That passion, they're tone policing you. It's okay to be passionate and emotional when you actually speak. It's a part of who we are, and we need to own that. And just because other people are uncomfortable with your passion doesn't mean that you have to be censored for that, right? And Edwina, that is my biggest fear in terms of traveling, knowing where it's safe to, absolutely, right? Like when we travel and we see historically how we've had to make connections, to be able to say, where is it safe for us to travel and where is it not safe for us to travel? I'm thinking of the Green Book, and in the South where, Black folks had to actually write down what towns were sundown towns. If you don't know what a sundown town is, when the sun went down, they didn't want any Negroes around. Otherwise, there might be some real negative things that were happening, including loss of life, right? And so these are things that we as people of color, as Black people, we live and operate in these systems even today. In this particular moment, this type of surveillance is actually happening. And it's important for us to be conscious of how we are actually experiencing that and the difference from our white counterparts, right? Actually raise these issues up. It's not to deny a white person's experience. It's to say, shouldn't we actually have a similar experience of not being surveyed every time we go out into the world? Don't you want that for us as your friends and your comrades and your allies? And we hope that your answer is yes. I know the 42 people who are here with us that your answer is yes, but we'd like to see that on a larger, more systemic, more institutionalized scale as well.
I'd like to tease out one more question in the chat, and then for the time, since we have 2 more topics to go, we can hopefully go to the next one. So Sarah mentioned a good point, which was, I do not get offended when someone detects my accent and asks the equivalent of, where are you from? No matter how clumsy it sounds like, I appreciate their curiosity, and the instance may open doors. And for me as a white person, like if I do want to reach out and connect with somebody, that's a great point. And I don't know exactly how to approach that always. So our next, excuse me, our next topic, free to be successful. So we have a few slides here on.
I'm going to show this slide first, and then we'll go to the results to see where people fall on the scale of things. So Robin, here is your definition of the universal high performance. And if you could just drop in the chat, which category or label did you actually fall under, given your definition of equity and your definition of equity as achieved through? And then if you have feedback on how, you're emotionally responding to that, we'd love to hear that in the chat as well.
And then we also wanted to, should we just do the data first and then go to the results on this one?
Sure.
Okay, since we're already in there. So we also have some key data on the next series of slides that what Rachel was talking about about the inequities around housing and education and healthcare, et cetera. So looking at it from a business instructor side, let's look at some of the actual data and economic numbers. And the data is pretty clear. And for me, this was a real sobering exploration around these gaps. So the first gap is, you see here, the wage gap between Black, African American, and whites has been growing since 2000. Whites average 2 times the average wage of Black African Americans. That's from the Economic Policy Institute. And on the right, we have net worth. Net worth of whites is 10 times the net worth of Black African Americans. And maybe in the chat you can put, why do you think that is? Why is the net worth of whites 10 times the net worth of Black/African Americans? And then on the next slide, we have some additional numbers. Black African Americans have the highest rate of unemployment, and then Black African Americans have twice the poverty rates of whites. We can reflect on that. And then our next slide, the gap between white and Black home ownership is 31% greater for whites, and aligned with that, Black African American applying for mortgages are denied at 3 times the rate of whites. How does that feel? And put that in the chat. And then our last numbers, Black African American babies under age 1 die at twice the rate of white babies. Black African American mothers die from childbirth at 3 times the rate of white mothers. The healthcare issue. And Black African Americans are shot at and killed by police at twice the rate of whites. So the data is pretty clear. And actually, my son was explaining this to me. He said, for folks who are still holding on to the concept of meritocracy and that it is equal rights and that everybody does have an equal playing field, his explanation was this. It's like, hey, Dad, it's kind of like a Monopoly game, which we used to play a lot. We've all played Monopoly. And, you know, it's a long game, but at a certain stage of the game, some people have the advantage and they're more likely to win, right? So all the properties have been allocated and some people have more money in their bank. And if you, at that point, brought in a whole new series of players and said, the game's fair, you know, we're starting from scratch and the game's fair, everybody has the same access, structurally that's not true, right? So because the resources have already been allocated.
Mm-hmm.
So looking at the chat, oh yeah, redlining. I don't know if everybody knows what redlining is.
Oh, redlining. It's so interesting because I just gave a presentation on digital redlining. So redlining has expanded over, you know, the last couple of generations. But in general, what we're talking about is the process for actually getting approved for something like a home loan, right? Where there is a process where the you have to mark all the boxes in order to get approved. And those boxes are designed in a way that disadvantages people of color, Black folks, like, and so banks will be able to say, like, you know, people from this neighborhood or people who make this this amount of money, they use these type of statistics in an unfair way. So it further increases the wealth of white folks while decreasing the wealth of Black folks. Yeah, I feel you, Edward. I'm a first generation as well in my family, and that definitely uplifted us out of poverty. And yet, you know, we're still on the low end. There's still a lot of low income mentality that happens within our families, right? And I think there's a lot of unlearning to do. And then there's a lot of knowledge that we just don't have. I had the privilege of speaking to, you know, a money guy about the differences between something like a high-end dividend whole life insurance policy where you bank on yourself. And this is a secondary way for you to actually get a savings without having to go to the bank and open a savings account. And I had no idea what he was talking about and felt super educated on this. Come to find out that this is something that has been offered, you know, for almost 40 years now, right? And so this has increased the wealth of some while decreasing the wealth of others. And so this is all a part of that system that we're talking about, how racism specifically becomes institutionalized. I did put the chart back up here because I wanted to see where folks to see kind of where they fall on the scale of things here. And then I'm just going to stop sharing so that we can see the results of the survey. All right. So here is our free to be successful survey, 33 responses. Okay. Which definition of equity most closely aligns with your line of thinking? Fair competition, equal opportunity, universal high performance, freedom from oppression. I'm so glad that the freedom of oppression came out on top with 55.9%. I know that puts you on the transformative side of things in terms of you really do want to transform the systems that we're currently operating in. And really what we're talking about in terms of being equity minded is access, right? Access to resources, access to information, access to those types of knowledge bases that helps folks make choices that can transform their lives. On the other hand, the big one here is this equal opportunity. And so just taking a look at the equal opportunity here, falls in more the liberal aspect of things, right? Now I'm going to go back to the other survey, scroll down to the I believe equity is achieved through part. 67.6% said changing oppressive structures and promoting empowerment. Again, on that transformative level of things. And so that right there is really, really inspiring to see in terms of the responses. It means that we are trying to think, about how to dismantle and deconstruct some of the systems that we're operating within, and that we do want to move towards changing oppressive structures and promoting empowerment across all of our lives. I think earlier in the chat, Edward had said, cultural wealth wasn't necessarily put into this equation, and that would definitely skew kind of the definitions and the data that's offered up here by Marsh Hall et al. In 2018. I 100% agree. Like, I don't want to ever discount, the background and the culture that I come from. There is a wealth of cultural wealth that we have to bring to the table, but it's not always incorporated in the economic outcomes that we see every day.
I can speak to this as a white person. This one was a hard one for me to unpack and come to grips with, but it was so central to really unpack, to let go of this belief that, my success has been due to my hard work and my efforts, and not looking in the rearview mirror or in the mirror in front of me about the white supremacy that was part of the wind beneath my wings on that, which meant I would have to let go of, okay, so my definition of my success has to include the fact that I'm white. And can I do that without reducing me feeling like, hey, I worked hard and I've achieved some success, and I'm also white and had some advantages. And the truth is, I'm both.
Right. I don't want to discount the hard work that people have put into making their lives what their lives are, right? And at the same time, I want to acknowledge that because of our skin differences, we started at different places on the playing field, right? If you're starting at the top of the mountain and I'm starting at the bottom of the mountain, it's going to take me a much further, distance to be able to catch up and to reach that finish line of where we want to be.
I think it's one of the areas where it's particularly challenging for whites who either come from or still are working class, right? Because they also are working with the Horatio Alger myth that, you know, we can lift ourselves up by our bootstraps. And as you say, Rachel, I mean, it doesn't discount that there's a lot of hard work that goes into that. I feel like I've done some of that, but I didn't get to where I am strictly on my own. Because along the way, had I not been white, I also, some of those advantages that I took, that I had, I wouldn't have, right?
Right.
I'm not saying I wouldn't be here. I don't know, right? Because we've got such a messed up system. I don't know. All I know is that while I did work hard, I am not where I am strictly because of that.
Absolutely. Well, y'all, we have about 20 minutes left. Are we ready to kind of transition into our last section? I'm going to go ahead and see if we can find our last survey here.
So in our last survey, we're going to be looking at which lives matter most. And it's a challenging rhetorical situation as well as just a challenging situation. And so we've got a survey for you to take again. And while you do that, I'll just tell you that it's, I think, a better survey question than where we came from, because we had true-false survey questions and I found I couldn't answer them. I couldn't even answer them. It sort of goes back to the struggle that some of you were having without the definitions in the last survey. When asked whether or not white lives matter, I couldn't answer, because if it's just do white lives matter, well, I have to say yes. But as I say yes, I'm cognizant that at the moment that is so not a full answer that I can't possibly say that that's true. So hopefully our current survey questions that you're in the midst of filling out will reveal to us a little more complicated story, and we'll have a good conversation about that.
There are no right or wrong answers. I know we've mentioned that with each one of these surveys, but this one specifically, I think it's pretty important for us to acknowledge that there are no right or wrong answers to these surveys. Friends, I'm going to get some water. I'll be right back.
And feel free to light up the chat regarding this concept of whose lives matter. I would love to hear folks weigh in. I know I had an experience of putting a Black Lives Matter yard sign up, and I would say it's probably an older and more conservative neighborhood, and folks stopping and asking me about my sign, a sign that I was really excited to put up, and then going through some stages of disappointment, and even actual concern. And then my partner, she lives in the same neighborhood, putting up a sign as well, and actually being confronted, with strong objections, and her being called racist for putting that sign up.
They called you racist for putting it up?
No, this is my partner. She also lives in the same neighborhood, and she had a sign up as well. An older white person told her that the sign was racist and needed to be taken down. And it was just such a mix of emotions of going from a place where you're feeling and desiring to be supportive and excited about getting the discussion going, to this realization, and how naive as a white person, I guess, but this realization of, what? You don't feel this way too? And something that I'm sure the people of color on this workshop would be like, duh.
Well, as I'm sitting here and you're explaining that, I have a very different experience. I know you and I have talked about this earlier in the summer when George Floyd's happened, and we all had to experience it together as a nation. And quite the opposite experience as you, feeling liberated enough to actually put a Black Lives Matter sign in your front yard. I felt highly uncomfortable in my Black skin living in my very suburban Oceanside neighborhood. Like 2 or 3 days after George Floyd was murdered by the police, my neighbor put his Trump 2020 flag up on his house. Now, I'm not here to like question what your politics are. I really am uninterested in having that conversation with anyone. I know exactly where I stand, and I don't want to, get into that kind of political conversation. But I will say that changed the dynamic for me. Here is this older white male who has always been exceptionally kind to me and my Black children, who is really the grandpa of the neighborhood. My neighborhood was very embracing of us when we moved in, but it was intolerable thinking about the type of frustration that I felt as Black lives were being killed in the street, and everybody was rushing to protest to be able to say that we all care and that we all think that this is a horrific situation that should be handled. And it's part of the reason why I decided to move out of that neighborhood and pack my family up, and return to the home of my parents, during the pandemic, until we can figure out what the world is going to be like post-COVID. Or I don't even know if we're ever going to be post-COVID. But I can tell you that being in my parents' neighborhood now, that it's a much more mixed neighborhood. When I walk outside, I do see people who look like me. I do see both signs represented in terms of Black Lives Matter and the Trump 2020. And there's a much more celebratory kind of on both sides. And it makes me feel as if I'm okay again in my skin, as I can walk around the neighborhood with my children and I can go bike riding with them without having to worry about, the nice white guy who's going to vote against my lives, coming up in this election. Again, I'm so sorry if I'm putting my political politics out there, but this is the response that I had, in this particular moment, and how that made me feel in my body. And thank you, my friends. I see the chat here saying that I know, I know, Christy, man, I wish I could have packed you up. Christy was my neighbor, right? Like literally my neighbor. And I know that, her and her husband and I, had conversations, about this too. But there are some moments when we have to make some tough decisions about the safety of who we are and our families. And when my mother, said she'd give me free babysitting through the entire pandemic, I just went for it.
Are we ready for the reveal, Rachel?
I think so. Let's do this, my friends. When doing inclusive work, focusing on one racial identity runs the risk of being exclusionary. All right, we have a nice mixture here. We have a 13.8% of us said that they strongly disagree. We have 31% who said they disagree. We have 13.8% who said that they are neutral. We have 31% who say that they do agree that focusing on one racial identity can run the risk of being exclusionary. And then we have 10.3% who said that they strongly agree that when we are doing inclusive work, focusing on one racial identity runs the risk of being exclusionary. How are we feeling about this?
I know for one thing, the exclusionary part, it's not just exclusionary. This one always like pushes that button of segregation, right? So are we segregating? Rachel, you heard an earlier version of a workshop that I'm going to be offering at Maricosta soon. And the earlier version, in a way, was calling for a kind of segregation, because I really do feel that white people need to get together and get past this unwillingness to say we're white, this unwillingness to look at racism and talk about racism. And then, right, you have to do those before you can actively be an anti-racist and do the work of anti-racism. And I had several colleagues, Nate among them, who said, oh, don't do that. Please don't do that. And I'm not for now, because I agree. I think it's a very risky zone. And yet I do think there are times that the work calls for that. But what we have to remember is, even if the work calls for that, we have to look at then re-entering the other spheres, right? It's a temporary moment that one makes that kind of choice, I think, at least in the instance I'm talking about. I don't think this is a blanket, as you can tell by our graph here, by the responses. I don't think it's a blanket for all situations.
I wanted the work. It was the title.
No. I am not being critical. I'm just saying that, you know, the having only one race involved in something pushes the segregationist button openly, right? Yeah. And yet there may be times for, I think, some work like that, but always cognizant of the challenge not to stay there.
Just reading through the chat here, and some really beautiful, commentary coming up. Denise put safety matters. It really does. Craig said, well put, Donna, as this has been so educational for me. All of the examples, analogies, and anecdotes from the panel and in the chat have helped open my eyes to this conversation and important perspectives. Thanks again all for sharing. As a white male, I have experienced so many advantages I did not even realize. And I agree, the chat has been so amazing. Thank you for being vulnerable and putting yourselves out there on the line. Edward, racial reconciliation requires us to leave our individualistic position for the greater good of those most oppressed, thus becoming a better union. This is why I think that even when doing inclusive work, it's perfectly okay to focus on one particular racial identity so that we can unpack that. Then we can make relationships between and across those other racial identities. When I teach intercultural communication, I always like to, use the metaphor of a family, right? When you're in your home and you're in your family, do you want your neighbor coming in to tell you how to decorate your house, tell you when your children should be getting up and getting dressed, tell you what kind of breakfast you need to cook? Does your neighbor have any business being in your home, telling you how things should be? In many ways, it's just like that. When Black folks get together to talk about Black stuff, we talking amongst Black folks about our Black stuff. And we don't necessarily need anybody else monitoring that and telling us how they feel when they don't share the same lived experiences or the political exclusions, the economic exclusions, the institutionalized exclusions that we have and are particular to our identity. Now, does that mean that you can't be an ally with us and for us? No, absolutely you can. It just means that you also have to respect the fact that all spaces are not spaces for you, right? And this is something in the course of 20 years that has happened over and over and over again when white folks want to, put themselves out there on the line, that they really want to be involved, so they think they can go anywhere and everywhere. And that's something that I highly encourage my white friends in the audience here to just think about, like, what's making me feel as if I have to be a part of that specific conversation, right? When we're ready to share out, trust. We will share out, right? And you will become a part of that intercultural dynamic that helps to cause systemic change in the way that we're all looking for. Yeah. Oh, the chat got lit again. I have to scroll back a little bit. Lisa said, unless there is a vaccine and made available to all races, we will be in COVID until 90% of our population has the disease. I know, my friend, I know. Maybe it's wishful thinking. Christy says not to be political, but people we thought and had the same desire to have beautiful integrated communities have exposed themselves. They did, right? Absolutely. And it's unfortunate. May says, I'm surprised by these findings, but maybe I should not be. I do anti-racism work on my campus, and I do get a lot of resistance from other racial groups saying, why am I mainly focusing on anti-Black racism? And that is not something that's going to be foreign to any of us. When we start talking about specifically anti-Black racism, people do feel excluded, right? People feel as if they want their narrative to run parallel to that narrative. But in some of the slides that we'll end with today, you'll see that the data does not mean that we're all on the same playing field. And there's definitely reason for us to focus on one particular racial identity in this moment right now, right? I'm going to actually go to those slides because we only have a few minutes. I really want to make sure that we don't leave you all just thinking that, that this isn't supported by the data. Okay. So when we talk about which lives matter most, I'm going to specifically focus in on the question that has been facing us over this summer, which is that of the cycle of criminalization. And this is a term that I use to connect the preschool to prison pipeline to our police relations and to the prison system, and how policy is one of those things that infiltrates and ties all of these things together. So very quickly, I'll give you some statistics about Black folks within the educational system. We know that Black preschool children are 3.6 times more likely than white children to receive out-of-school suspensions. This is preschool children, my friends. Like preschoolers are getting suspended from preschool, right? And Black children are 3.6 times more likely than their white counterparts to have this type of experience. When you apply this to the K through 12, Black students are 1.9 times more likely than white students to be expelled. And when there are police officers or security officers on that campus, they are 2.3 times more likely to be disciplined by those officers, such as a school-related arrest. Right? And in a moment, I'll connect that to how that impacts our relationship with the police once they leave those educational systems and they start to walk in our everyday streets. But before I get there, we'll take a gendered look at this, and we'll come to realize that Black girls are 5.5 times more likely to be suspended from their white peers. And most of this has to deal with them speaking out and speaking their minds in a way that people don't like. They're seen as aggressive, they're seen as assertive, and then they're punished for that as opposed to being celebrated as having leadership qualities. Now, this is the statistic that really hits home for me, and I hope that these statistics hit home for you. I want you to understand that right here and right now, the data shows us that the number 6 cause of death for Black men in the United States is the police. So when Black Lives Matter rose out in response to the type of police brutality and police violence that we experience in the United States, it's not because, we just think that only Black people matter. It's because we are dying every single day to the point where the number 6 cause of death is the police. And this is just unacceptable on all ends, right? When you further look at this, a Black man dies at the hands of the police every 28 hours. And 1 in 1,000 Black men can be expected to be killed at the hands of the police. 1 in 9 Black men will see the inside of a prison during their lifetime. So if we connect the dots here, we enter the school system. That school system tells us that our behavior is adverse, right? And that should be punished in some way. So we leave the school system, we go into the street, and we're just living our lives. And then we also have the impact of being surveyed by the police. And that ends up either in death or lockup, right? So speaking of lockup, let's go to this last one here and talk about mass incarceration. 2.3 million people are currently incarcerated within the United States. 5% of the world's population. That's what we have here. And yet we own 25% of its inmates. And as a nation, we spend over $80 billion on incarceration every single year. When you do the breakdown and you start to look at the impact this has on our families, in the United States, 1 in 9 African-American children, 1 in 28 Hispanic children, and 1 in 57 white children have an incarcerated parent. These numbers are dire, right? These numbers mean that when a parent gets incarcerated, that aunties and uncles have to step up, that grandmas and grandpas have to step up, that the system that has already been disadvantaging us has to end up in care of these children, right? And so all of these point to how more than 5 million children, representing 7% of all US children, have ever had a parent who's lived with them go to jail or prison. Now, I'm not going to necessarily ask you all, I'm not going to ask you all how many of you have been to prison or have known someone who's been to prison, but I can tell you right now that every single Black male in my family and most of the men of color have had some interaction with the police and with the prison system. And that's not saying my family members are criminals. I do not come from a family of criminals, although some people do make mistakes. This is the life that we're living, where we know that we're always at risk of these types of situations when we step out of our houses and out of our homes. So the question that I would like to leave you all today, and my colleagues, what I would like to leave you here with today is, how do we cultivate systemic resistance? How do we institutionalize our resistance? How do we engage in systemic resistance against institutionalized racism and cultivate acts of self-love and activate our cultural agency so that we can transform the institutions that we are a part of? Right? That puts us right at for me, it's 1:45 because I'm in Texas, I told you all, but 11:45 Pacific Standard Time, which is our end of the session. But I want to thank you so much for all of your vulnerability, all of your conversation, all of your contributions, and for your willingness to go with us on this journey as we unpacked many of the racial blind spots that we have in our everyday society. And with that, I'll leave Nate and Denise to, have any closing thoughts.
Thank you all for your vulnerability and participation. I'm sorry it could only be chat, but thank you for doing that.
Likewise, just gratitude for the open dialogue and the learning that came from it for myself and from what I can see in the chat, others as well. So sorry for the issues.
Before I stop broadcasting live, I want to let you know that we are about to have an empowered hour. And so in a few minutes, the main stage will be full of wonderful videos curated across our 3 campuses, bringing, highlighting the advocacy that is happening from our students, from our staff, from folks who really do want to engage in this type of change. And I hope that you will leave your camera on during this particular hour and watch some of the videos. I know that we're going to talk a little bit about voting. I know we're going to look at first generational students. We're going to look at faculty, staff, and admin who have come together to talk about transforming our institutions into anti-racist safe space where all of us can actually operate within. And I know that it's Domestic Violence Awareness Month. And so my students have been making videos advocating on behalf of raising awareness for around intimate partner violence. And I would love it if you would support them by visiting their Hoops to End Abuse booth in our expo and clicking on that network button all throughout our empowered hour. We want to connect with you, and we want you to connect with others at our Try Equity conference. So thanks for giving equity a try today, and thanks for sharing all of these wonderful stories with us. We look forward to being empowered in the next hour with you. Bye-bye, my friends.